Welcome to It's Not You, It's Grief, a safe space to have candid conversations surrounding the many faces of grief. How do you handle the process while moving forward and ultimately getting back to living in the moment? Come on this journey as we navigate grief through the art of storytelling. And now for your host, Ahira Smith.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of It's Not You, It's Grief podcast. I just want to say thank you so much for joining me on this journey. I really do appreciate it. This has been a labor of love of mine for several months, and now it's come to fruition. And all I can just say is thank you so much for joining me on this special day for this special cause. So, what is this podcast about? Well, it is about grief, as you can clearly guess with the title, but not just that of grief from that of a loss of a loved one in terms of their transition from life to death, but also grief for those of us who may experience in various forms. It could be from that of a marriage dissolved, separation, divorce, the grief that you may be experiencing on the job. I know a lot of people who are experiencing a lot of toxic environments, and there's a lot of havoc on their place of employment due to circumstances that are beyond their control, where grief is very much a factor. There may be some people who are experiencing grief through illness. Unfortunately, a lot of people have been impacted by the pandemic itself. And even before the pandemic, that might have been experiencing some other forms of health illnesses like cancer, diabetes, and anything that has taken them from the optimal health to where now their health has to be compromised due to circumstances that may be out of their control. There's also those who are experiencing grief through that of natural disasters, people losing their homes, losing their livelihood, jobs, businesses might have folded for one reason or another. One thing that I have definitely come to understand about this journey called life is that grief is inevitable, just as much as it is part of the change process, but it does not necessarily mean we have to be reduced by that. But there are going to be occasions that it does change you. You're going to not be your best. And I think it's important that we start having these conversations in front, face to face, and not having these silo conversations on the side or behind closed doors, because this not only impacts you, but it also impacts your loved ones, those who are closest to you. And there's just way too many resources that are out there now that has become available to a lot of folks. And we need to utilize these resources because, again, grief is just part of the journey. One of the things that I have also had the privilege of acknowledging that it is not something you can get around. It's not something you can get over, get under, get beneath it. You have to go through it. And for me, what I want this podcast to be is a safe space, a platform for people to be able to share their stories, be able to talk about how they are moving forward with their own grief, to living back in the moment. And we do that by the art of storytelling and just living it minute by minute, because clearly, as we have all known these last couple of years, things change from one minute to the next. So this is part of the reason why I want to do this podcast. And just to be clear, I want to definitely put this disclaimer out there. I can't give you guys no type of prescriptions for any type of medication. I can't write any documentation to get you out of work or to get you out of any type of commitments that you have made prior to joining this podcast. That is something you really have to talk to a health provider about that if you do need some assistance, because grief is real as well. It is part of mental health awareness. And again, I know from my own personal experience that Every little bit helps. Every little bit helps. It really does. So if you need to talk to a professional, please do so. Don't get in that frame of mind that, oh, I don't need to talk to anybody. I can handle this. If that's the case, you wouldn't really be on this podcast to hear what's out there. And so again, I really want to make sure that you guys understand that you may feel like you're alone, but you are not by yourself. There are people who are willing to listen, who are able to help you. I'm one of those people because I'll be completely transparent. I did not want to do no podcast on no grief. Okay. I did not. These last 4 or 5 years I've been surrounded by grief. And let me just tell you, I'm tired of grief. I don't like grief. It doesn't feel good. It's not supposed to feel good. But I try to run away from something that truly is apparently that's been put on my heart and my spirit from the divine one above me, and it's gotten to the point where I'm very comfortable when it comes to grief. It no longer is something that I run away from, and in fact, it's one of those things that I stand in the midst of it, just to be able to help other people through their own journeys of grief. And so that's what this podcast is for. It's one of the areas that I really want to make sure that we're reaching out to the masses and just have people start those internal conversations with themselves and with other people in their area and their network to be there for one another, because everybody's going through something. Let's be clear about that. Everybody's going through something. Just because they don't say it doesn't mean that it's not happening. So I definitely would like for us to just really ride this journey, whether you stay with me from beginning to the end, or you decide to just listen to a couple of episodes and then feel like, you know what, I got a lot of good nuggets out of this, and I'm just going to go ahead and start seeing a professional for much more concrete assistance. By all means, if that's what this podcast was able to do, that's great. That's what I want you to do. And if it's one of those things where you would like to talk with me further about your own experiences with grief, please, I welcome that as well. Definitely down the road, I am going to I'm going to make myself available to help people through their own grief journey, and to, again, making their way to living in the moment so that they can be present for those who need them the most. And so, with that being said, let me go ahead and just tell you right now, this podcast is it's going to be different, and I'm sure you've heard that a number of times from other podcasts if you've listened to different ones. It's different because, one, it's me. I've never done a podcast before, but you know what? I talk to a lot of people just because of my roles, and in my professional career, as well as just the relationships I've had the privilege of developing over the years, both professionally and personally. I love talking with people. I love building relationships and networking with other people to help. If nobody can make it through this thing called life without having somebody there. So that's one thing about me with this podcast. It's really not only to help you, but it's also to help me through my own grief, because trust and believe you me, I'm still grieving. There's a lot of things that I'm still grieving through. Some things that I'm unpacking, even things that have might have happened years ago, and I do mean years and years ago, but I want to unpack it. I want to recognize it. I want to acknowledge it, and I want to move forward with it so I can be a better person. And that's really, really important to me at this stage in my life. So this is what this podcast is going to do. And with that, in my mind, and what my goal is to really create what I'd like to call an oasis space. And what that it's an acronym, actually, and the acronym stands for an organic, authentic, stimulating, intentional, safe space. Yes, an oasis, an organic, authentic, stimulating, intentional safe space. That is what I'm looking to create with my podcast, as well with my future endeavors with helping people with their grief. And so, with that being said, let me go ahead and get started with my story to kind of give you a background as to why I am talking about this and why am I deciding to do this on this particular day, which happens to be March 5th of 2023. So, to let you know, I am the youngest of three. I have two older brothers, and I was very blessed and fortunate to have two parents. I came from a two-parent home to a point where when I was in middle school, my parents ended up, being separated and divorced, like a lot of you, I'm sure, have out there have experienced that as well. And so for me, I was the youngest of the three and the only girl. And I was a daddy's girl. Let me be clear about that. I was a daddy's girl. I know nowadays in 2022 and 2020, with Kobe Bryant, rest in peace with him, he coined the phrase "girl dad." And I appreciated him phrasing that, because obviously he was a father of four. But before girl dad, I was definitely a daddy's girl. When I was growing up, I was a daddy's little girl. But when I grew up and became an adult, I definitely was my father's daughter. So I was very protective of my dad. And with that relationship, I was always very close with him. And so, we had these conversations before when my dad and I would talk about, the when the time comes for him to go home, be with the Lord. I would always be the type of person that just kind of put it off. I'm like, Dad, don't worry about it. We'll talk about it. Whatever you want, Pop, we'll handle it. Whatever you want it written out, we'll focus on it then and there. Right now, I want to focus on being in the moment with you. I want to spend time with my pop. And so let me put a pause right there. So let me tell you a little bit about my dad, Andrew W. Smith, also known as OD to some of his some of his classmates. My dad, as well as my mom, happened to be alumnus from the Kentucky State University. And so my dad's presence, if you ever came in contact and met my father, you felt his presence before he even walked into the room, because he was just that commanding. My dad had a very, very powerful presence. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. He was, when my father walked in the room, everybody was attentive and was keenly aware that my dad was in the room. And so what that, I think a part of that is because of his upbringing, because of my grandmother, and the values and the morals that she bestowed upon him and his siblings in terms of their faith. My father was very much a believer of God, father of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He bestowed that onto me and my siblings as well. And I think because of how strong and how depth his faith was in that of God and Christ, his presence was just enormous. And so I say all that because, again, when it comes to my dad, I saw my father as a very strong person. Now, was my dad perfect? Absolutely not. My dad was not perfect by any means. He made his mistakes like a lot of us do, but he owned up to it. And he just went forward with it. But he definitely was present in his faith in the Lord. And so the thing about my dad is that, again, when it came to talks about him ready to go, my dad got to the point in his life where he was ready to go. He's like, I've raised my kids, all y'all good kids. I got my grandkids. I'm good, And so for me, it was like, okay, Pop, when when you hear your elders sit there and say, oh, I may not be here next year, and you be like, Nana, you said that for the last 20 years and you're still here. I felt like that with my dad. I'm like, Dad, I said, I know you're not going to be here in the physical sense forever, but I got you now. So I'm going to hold on to that. So on February 25th, I got a call from my dad's wife who had told me that he had a heart attack. Now, let me just say this. One thing about my dad in the various conversations we had was that, when if he had to pick if he had to pick a place to where he wanted to make that transition, or when he wanted to be called home to be with God, and he said he didn't want to be home per se. He said the one place you wouldn't really think about, but then again, it makes sense for him. It was church. Believe it or not, my father said church, and I'm like, wow, okay, that's pretty deep and that's pretty raw. So on this particular day, February 25th, happened to be a Sunday. Now, my dad goes to church every Sunday. Sometimes, if he wanted to, he'll go twice a Sunday because he was a deacon at this particular church. So as my dad attended church for that Sunday, he did his normal thing. He was present. He listened to the sermon, got in his little motorized chair, and started scooting around and saying goodbye to some of the other church members, and made his way to usually go to the bathroom, use the restroom, and then he'd get in the car and then go back home to have his supper. Yes, my dad had supper. He didn't have dinner. In Kentucky, a lot of times they say supper, but nevertheless, that was my dad. And on this particular Sunday, again, he got on his little motor scooter, went to the bathroom at the back of the church, closed the door for his privacy, and my dad had a heart attack. And when we got word, my brothers and I got word that he had his heart attack, we obviously rushed there. And when we were told where it happened, obviously we said he got it. He got what he asked for. And so my dad was on life support for a few days after that, up until March 1st. My dad did not ever want to be on life support, but we had him on life support for a short period of time so our family members and friends could come from all over the country to be there with him. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. And on March 1st of 2018, we said goodbye to my dad. He was taken off of life support. And in that moment, I knew then and there that whatever I had been going through beforehand in terms of my short-term lived experiences of grief, or what I knew about grief, in terms of how I handled grief, I knew once he passed, anything and everything that was suppressed was no longer going to be suppressed. It was going to be erupted. And so with that being said, my brother and my dad's wife, we got together. We were able to make the arrangements for my father's homegoing service to be on March 5th at 11 o'clock. And it was a beautiful homegoing service. My father was not only an opera singer, but he was also a professor at the Kentucky State University for a number of years. And he had former musical students that came all over across the country to be there to say goodbye to him in song, one being Precious Lord, and another one being It Is Well With My Soul. Beautiful renditions of both those songs. And it helped me, and it helped my family to really be able to send our father off the way he wanted it to be. Now, let me put a pin in it just for a second. So that was March 5th of 2018. Now, at this time, my mother was still with us, thank the Lord. But my mother's health was not doing well. My mother had been in and out of the hospital for periods of time because my mother was dealing with her own health issues. She was a diabetic and she was a kidney transplant recipient. And, she was dealing with a lot. And I'll be completely transparent with you all. My parents got divorced at years after my brothers and I had left the house. And I know that my mother very much still loved my dad. And I know my brothers and I did not tell our mother that our dad passed. They weren't on speaking terms, but nevertheless, I can tell you without a shadow of doubt that had we told our mother that our dad had passed, even though they were not together, had we told her that he had passed, we would have lost both our parents that same year. I believe that very much, very much. And so we didn't tell her. We had talked about telling her, um, like a year after he had gone, but once again, the universe kind of intervened, and my mother's health was not that well, and we just couldn't do it. We could not do it. So here it is, 2020, February 27th. I get a call from my brother out in California who tells me that um, my mother, our mother passed. Yes, our mother passed on February 27th of 2020. Almost 2 years to the date that we said goodbye to our dad. Now, again, here's how the universe really shows how great it is. So my brothers and I, we come together to plan out the services for our mom. And again, as we're talking to the funeral director, we're making the arrangements in terms of where it's going to be held, what time. My mother lived in Boston, Massachusetts, and she was going to be laid to rest in Tennessee next to her mom and the rest of the kinfolk. And interesting enough, when we decided on the day that we were going to have it, I remember vividly it said, well, we're going to have it on this Thursday. It was Thursday of 2020, of March 5th, 2020. The same March 5th that we just had a service of our father 2 years ago. And so when he said the date, I immediately recognized, and I said, March 5th, 2020. And he said, yeah, 6 o'clock, right? Yeah. And my brothers looked at me like, what's with that date? I said, dude, we just had dad's funeral on March 5th, 2020. 2018. You talk about an awakening. We couldn't say anything. We just kind of shook our heads. We were just like, yeah, that's about right. That's about right. And so sure enough, we had the service for our mom at 6 o'clock on March 5th, 2020, exactly 2 years to the day to where we 2 years prior to that, we had our dad's service on March 5th, 2018 at 11 o'clock in the morning. And I can tell you between 2018, I mean, even before 2018 when I lost my dad, but I can really tell you without any uncertainty that from the time that my father had passed to where I got the news that my mother had passed 2 years to that time, I was in a state of grief. I was literally in a state of grief. Now, what that looks like, I was all over the place. I was dealing with bouts of grief. They say there's 5 stages of grief. There's acceptance and denial and anger and depression. Let me tell you something. I was all over the place. It's not like one thing. It's not like a connected dot. You can give it to a 2-year-old to try to tell the 2-year-old to connect the dots on those 5 stages of grief. And the 2-year-old probably had 1/4 of an inkling exactly what I was looking like. I was all over the place, But one thing I can say that really helped me was the support that I got from the therapy that I had, that I made myself go and see. Because I told you before, when my dad passed, anything and everything that was suppressed prior to that was no longer suppressed. It was like ripping up Pandora's box. And so now here we are again, 2 years almost to the date that we lose our mom. And the funeral is the same day as my mother's, 2 years apart. And then on top of that, shortly afterwards, after we had the service of our mom and we were able to lay our mom down, take her to her final resting place, then we had the pandemic set upon us. So when I tell you that grief was upon me, it was on me. I can't speak for my brothers. I can't speak for anybody else. But one thing I will tell you is that there is no blueprint to this shit. Grief is so organic. Everybody's process of grief, it's different, and it's supposed to be. It really is. The way I grieve, the way you grieve, the way somebody grieves over a loss of a child, to a parent, to a sibling, to a best friend, and that's just in dealing with death. We're not talking about just the relationships that happen, or we're not talking about what takes place at a job or natural disasters or your own grief in terms of your health. There are so many facets to grief. But one thing I want to say is that it is a moment that you can live through it to get to the point where you can be back in the present. And it's depending on who you have with you, who's going to be there to support you, to give you give you the tools and resources, but it always falls back onto you on what you want to do. And I want you to understand that it's okay not to be okay. You may be alone, but you're not by yourself in this whole journey of grief. And that's what I wanted to convey with you, that there's many facets of grief, but that doesn't mean that there's not ways to deal with it. And you will deal with it. You can't avoid it at all. And so that's just a small story about my own experience with grief. And trust me, there's going to be people who are going to come on this podcast who's going to tell you their own experiences about grief, from the jobs to illnesses to losing their parents and loved ones and all that stuff. But I really hope and pray that whatever you get out of this, it's something that will help you come to terms with grief. It helps you find the support that you need to deal with your own grief, and understand that it's just part of the journey. It's part of the journey that we were given when we came here. And I just really hope and pray that this is something that will help you become better in whatever it is that you're facing. Okay. So with that being said, again, my goal again is to just be here as another support for you. There's going to be times when we're going to cry. There's going to be times when I'm going to laugh. There's going to be times where we're going to be a little angry, but guess what? That's just part of the grief process, and that's okay. It really is okay. It's okay not to be okay. It's okay not to be happy all the time. There's going to be triggers. There's going to be moments, but guess what? Those triggers and moments don't have to last always. It starts within. It really does. And so I thank you so much for joining me on this really special day. I know my parents are with me. I know that they're always with me. They are. And, because of them, I'm able to talk about this out loud. And because of the people who have rallied around me, from my classmates to my colleagues to people who I don't even know, who heard the story before, they too feel it, in their own grief. And I'm glad it resonates with people, because grief resonates with everybody. Again, it's just how we deal with it, how we process it, how we face it. And I don't want anybody to face it alone. And that's just me, because I didn't face it alone, and I don't want anybody to ever feel like they have to face it alone when you don't. There's way too many resources and people out there for that to even happen. So with that being said, thank you so much for joining me tonight. I look forward to having this conversation on this podcast. More information will be forthcoming on how you can reach me. But again, thank you so much. Peace and blessings to you all. I hope you all have a productive week. And until next time, be well.
Thank you for listening, being intentional, and sharing this moment with us. We at It's Not You, It's Grief deeply understand the many facets of grieving, and we want to make sure we can be here for you. Again, thank you for listening, and tune in again wherever you subscribe to podcasts. We look forward to seeing you next time. Be well.